Okay, but is anyone having trouble hearing me? Okay, great. So, like I said, my background is in parliamentary debate and a little bit of college LD. A lot of this will apply. I just want to give that as like a little disclaimer because I feel like you all have coaches and you might have heard something different from someone, a coach, another competitor, somebody who taught you at a camp that might not fully agree with what I'm saying. And while I'm pretty sure I'm right, I do want to be conscientious of, like the format differences. Maybe, I don't know. I don't want to like discredit anybody who you trust who disagrees with like my outlook on uh, cross-examination. So that's the first disclaimer. The second is that I think the best way to participate in this lecture is to, since it is on cross-examination, to try to have one, at least two, or at least one, maybe two, ideally, questions written down and ready to ask either at the end or at some point in the middle. You can either turn on your camera, which I know people don't want to do probably, or you can just hit the little, you're all in school on Zoom, you know how it works, right? The digital hand raise thing. I'm happy to take a question at any point. And I think since the whole lecture is on asking and answering questions, it's pretty prudent to try to make sure you have a question. Some resources that might help you in addition to this lecture. We have a video on our channel about a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about. I don't want this lecture to be just a rehash of that, so I am going to skim over some things and go into more details and things that I didn't really talk about in the other video. But that video is called Asking Effective Cross-Ex Questions. It's like an hour long. There's another lecture from 2013, I think, from somebody named Bill Patterson, which is also on YouTube. That's like a 2-hour lecture. And I'm not going to lie, it's a little painful to get through at some parts because I don't know, I feel like, at least for my taste, a lot of these lectures are that I've seen like long form are very, I don't know, essay like. And there can be just long portions that don't feel relevant to what you need. But a lot of that information is good. I watched a bunch of like videos on YouTube about debate cross-ex, and almost all of the videos I found, I was like, I don't really agree with this, or I think this is really oversimplified and misses the mark. And most of those videos were 5 to 10 minutes long. This one, I think the speaker really knows what they're talking about. I think it's a valuable resource to use in addition to this lecture. So I guess with that said, I do want to buy a little bit of time for anybody who's going to be coming in late. So what are some questions you have right now, either about cross-ex or about debate in general or about me, before we kind of make the discussion more focused on cross-examination that we can get out of the way? Is that a question? Is it
Sorry.
Adriel or Adriel?
Adriel, yeah. I think.
Oh, hold on. I know what's up with the sound. Okay, can you try speaking now?
Sure.
Okay, great. I can hear you.
Okay, cool. I think that, and you're definitely going to touch on it later because this is a pretty general thing, but I think the biggest thing that I struggle with is question generation. No matter how good or bad the people that I'm debating against are, usually I'll have one like really good, like, oh yeah, totally got them question, and then everything else just kind of falls apart. So I think that's something that I need a lot of help with, is question generation, like on the spot.
Yeah, great. And it's really good for me to know which things specifically like to touch on. So that's great. I will talk about that. And most of what I'll be saying is that I think it's a bigger question, or like a bigger issue than a lot of people think, right? It's not like one
Mhm.
skill that you can practice in isolation. It's kind of a
Yeah.
culmination of a lot of things, but we'll get into it. Is that another question? Or just any other questions? It can be about cross-X. It cannot be about cross-X. My favorite color is red. I'm a Gemini.
Sasan, this is not about cross-sex. I was just
Sure.
interested. I know that you've said in videos before that you didn't do debate in high school. How
Mhm.
did you get into it in college?
My high school didn't offer debate. It does now. But at the time that I was going there, didn't offer speech and debate. I went to a community college, and part of the transfer requirements for everybody is you got to take a speech class. I took a speech class, like didn't really take it seriously, didn't show up. I was not a very good student. I get the impression that a lot of people who do like debate in high school are like very good students. I was not. Eventually I took a speech class that I liked and I stuck with, and somebody recommended I joined the team, and then I didn't. And then eventually way down the line, I did. And college debate is, I don't know, it's really cool. It's a lot smaller and more kind of a chill community. People from across different teams just hang out a lot more and get along a lot better than what I've personally seen. And I stuck with it. I started doing parliamentary debate. Um, at the time where I was competing, there was another format that was like an experimental format that was like one-on-one parley. I did really well in that. And then after I was finished at the community college level, I kind of stuck around and started helping my team, which I guess is pretty common for people who end up getting into coaching, that you kind of just start out peer coaching while you're on the team, and then you're just like an alumni that comes in and helps out. And eventually that kind of turned into me coaching more seriously and then getting like real coaching jobs. And now I teach like for like academies, but mostly like beginning, like, welcome to your first public speaking class. You're in the 4th grade. Here's what this is. So not really like coaching on the like competitive high school level. Um, but yeah, Paul and I, who run the channel together, we both got a lot in our lives out of debate and feel weird about like making money off of it. So we decided that we'd make a channel to try to bring equity to it by making free resources, which is why I thought this lecture series was really cool, and wanted to participate. Kind of a side question. You mentioned that college debate is way more chill. That seems opposite of what I would expect, since like the people debating in college, I would assume, are more informed and competitive. Yeah, yes, but I think think of it this way. There's way fewer incentives to compete in college other than just you like debate, right? There's some scholarship stuff. Like if you're there on a debate scholarship, you have to debate in order to keep your scholarship. But it's not really like this, for lack of a better term, like clout chasing or like trying to make a really good resume to get into a college and like culture. There seems to be a lot more like enjoyment of the game. And people are just more mature. I think high school debate is weird to me, especially since I didn't compete there, because to me it's like the game of debate, but also like while you're going through the horrors of being a teenager and like a young person and all the wildness going on in your life at that time. Just people are more mature, they're nicer, um, because the winning and losing doesn't make a difference as much. And that's not speaking necessarily to the highest level, but most people in college debate are college students who just took a class, want to try this out, and are trying to like have an enjoyable weekend. Why do I think a lot of people like Jack Johnson, who are successful in high school, don't do debate in college? This is something I've been trying to get an answer to for a long time. And I don't think it's as simple as like one answer. I think the answer that they would give, that the Jack Johnsons of the world would give, is that, well, debate took a lot of time and it was kind of something that I had a emotional connection to in high school, and you don't have public forum in college. So it's different. It's not the same. I'm trying to do other things. I'm trying to do like college work and clubs, and I'm not trying to like focus all of my time on debate. I think there is another aspect to it on top of that that I haven't quite put my finger on, but do you guys know Ryan? I don't know like how I don't know why I said Ryan. Ryan Chen was a kid I went to high school with. Robert Chen. I don't know like how old this meme is, but Robert Chen, he had like the Robert Chen K was about him. He was like a kind of like a person who would debate. Yes. Okay. So I know Robert through work. Him and I worked at the same place together for a couple of years. And he's awesome. And he didn't compete his last year of high school, but when he did go to college, he went to Rice, which has like a really good college parley team. And he did compete in college parley for a little while. And then he stopped competing. And I haven't really talked to him much about that, but I do think there is just like a little bit of a cultural difference where that it is just not the same. I don't want to just presume that everything that's good about um, high school debate is also present on the college level. I think stuff like this, for example, this Discord, it doesn't really exist on the college level. There's a lot of really cool in-person stuff, but the community is just much smaller, so it's hard to, you know. And yeah, I don't know. I think maybe he just kind of missed that and wasn't as into it. But yeah, I think the general answer is the type of people who do high school debate are really academically driven. And while I think college debate can work with your academics just fine, if you're super academically driven and you want to get the most out of every aspect of college, it is kind of like a big time suck. How important do you think it is how important do you think getting into debate early, pre-high school is, and does it make much of an impact? I think it can matter. In my experience, so at the community college level, you work with debaters for 1 year, maybe 2 if you're lucky, but never more. So my experience has been getting debaters really good, really fast. One of the things that I've found coaching is that if somebody does have high school experience, it can sometimes be worse because they've learned things and kind of established habits in a certain way that's really hard to unteach them. And if they have bad habits or just things that aren't necessarily conducive to success in our specific format, that can work against them. But that comes down to coachability, like how adaptable are you to getting feedback and changing and stuff like that. And it can also come down to how good your coaches are. In college, pretty much everyone has a coach, right? If you're on a college team, that means that you have a coach who at least competed in speech at the college level, but usually competed in debate at the college level, was successful enough to want to make, a living out of it. So just the quality of coaching is a lot more like widespread in college. So with that said, yeah, I think you can start debate at any time and get good really quickly. If you're coachable, you have the right coaches, and you kind of just know who to listen to and know who not to listen to. What formats of college debate exist? Which do you recommend? This is a great question for public forum debaters because I'm told public forum exists to some capacity at the college level, but I don't know any like major national tournament that includes it. It depends on what you like about public forum, because if you're super into like card cutting and research and prep and stuff like that, then it's not necessarily going to translate to something like parliamentary debate. But the big formats of college debate are policy, which I can't really speak to. My understanding of policy is that it's really dwindling, especially in like our area. We had schools in California that wanted to keep doing policy but couldn't because all of their tournaments would require super far travel. But if you're in a region that has a lot of policy, I know that a lot of like Ivy League and super like academically elite schools still do policy at a really high level. And if you're somewhere that has policy, that could be a really good option for you. it can be really intense to get into from public forum. After that is NFA-LD, which is really similar to like high school circuit LD. If you like the prep aspect of public forum, I would recommend that. That's pretty widespread, pretty popular. There are a couple different formats of parliamentary debate. There's British parliamentary debate and or world schools. Like I think they're the same or they're slightly different. I don't really know much about that. I think it's popular. I bet it's good. The format of debate that I focus on is NPDA, which is a format of a different format of parliamentary debate. I think it's really good because we have value rounds sometimes, depending on where you are. The policy rounds are it's just more accessible. I think a lot of the skills you develop in public forum translate really well, and especially if you're competing in a circuit that like isn't as techy, you'll have a lot of the same kinds of judges. So like the sort of more lay, even honestly, kind of like the more flow or flay, I guess, judges you have in public forum can be more of the sort of lay judges in Parley. It does get really technical at the highest level, but it's a really enjoyable format, and I think it develops really good skills. I think the reason why I can give a lot of debate lectures is because parliamentary debate, you can't really prepare for the topics when you're not debating. You can try to get ready to talk about some things, but most of the work you do is in developing your general skills, and then you just figure out how to apply it to a given scenario in a really short amount of time. And I think that's a really useful thing. I think a lot of public forum is focused on like learning about the NSA and not as much about like a political disad in general. With that said, we're at 3:22. I think now's a good time to launch into it. If anybody came in a little bit later, there was some confusion about whether we were starting at 3 or 3:30, so I wanted to answer some general questions before we really got started. So that if anybody showed up at 3:30, they didn't miss like the advertised lecture. But with that said, I want to recap that your goal during this lecture should be to write at least one, ideally two, questions that you are going to ask me during or after the lecture at some point. There are no PowerPoint slides. I do have it structured out and I know what I'm going to talk about. But yeah, if you want to kind of like revisit this lecture, it's going to be posted on YouTube. The link's going to be in the same spreadsheet that led you here. So let's see. So I guess we're going to start with why cross-X matters. And I don't know, I feel like if you're here for a cross-X lecture, then you probably have some sense of that. But really, like, cross-X will do a lot of things. And I'm going to talk about all the good stuff that cross-X can accomplish. But really, at the end of the day, most judges, whether they are lay or not, will make the decision in the round based on who they think is supposed to win the debate. And sometimes that's really well informed. Sometimes it's just based off of some perception, right? Like all the judges that you've ever complained about, like judging based on like appearance or how someone spoke or whatever, right? When you are on the other side of that ballot, the feeling that you get is like, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing, and I'm really scared and nervous that I'm going to mess this up and ruin somebody's weekend, ruin somebody's career, not get them to some tournament, or like, God forbid, someone's going to yell at me. It happens in college debate. I've made decisions where the coach from the other team showed up and like chewed me out about why I voted that way, right? And people want to avoid that really badly. And the best way to avoid that is if one team seems like they're supposed to win and the other side seems like they're supposed to lose, then you just vote for the side that seems like they're supposed to win. Because ideally, no one will ask any hard questions at the end. And this happens all the time when like people are starting out in debate. even when they've been doing it for a while, they just don't sound like they're winning. Like they sound like they think they're doing a bad job. They sound like they expect to lose. And that kind of signals to the judge, like, if I vote against this person, they are not going to question me. They're not going to ask me any hard questions as to why. They're not going to like challenge my decision. So cross-ex is important, most importantly, because it is the easiest time for a judge to decide who they think is supposed to win the debate, not based on the flow, not based on the arguments, based on these two people are standing up right next to each other. They are hearing each other's arguments. They're responding to each other's arguments. Who just seems more confident? Who seems like what they're saying is controlling the debate? That is going to be maybe 80% of what makes the average lay judge's decision, but also experienced judges alike, right? Like repping out is real, right? If you are competing against a really well-known team that everyone expects to win, it's going to be really hard to win the debate by a little bit because the judges will just be really nervous. They'll be like, oh, technically, I think they do win on this, but like, what if I'm wrong? I don't know. It just seemed like, but you, on the other side, like sometimes the team that's supposed to like win won't do that great a job, but the judges will be like, oh, you're an amazing team. No feedback. You win. So repping out can play a big role even. So just that cross-ex is really important to establishing the idea in the judge's mind that you're supposed to win this debate round. There are 4 reasons to ask questions. Do I have like a... Yeah, I'll use this whiteboard. We go over this in the cross-ex video that I made. Interestingly enough, Bill Patterson, who gave the lecture long before I was doing debate, and I didn't see his video when I was making mine, has basically a very, very similar, it's the exact same list in the exact same order. He just calls them different things. But here are the reasons to ask questions. In other words, your cross-ex question should be trying to accomplish one of the following 4 goals in order of importance, from least to most important. So least important is information seeking / clarification. Why? Well, first, what is this? An information seeking question is like, let me make sure I have the little thing pulled up so I can let people in. Where is the participants? Okay, yeah, see, like there's somebody waiting. All right, if you're just joining us, we haven't gotten started for very long. You haven't missed much. We're just talking about what are you trying to accomplish when you're asking questions. The first thing is getting clarification or information seeking. What is that? That's just when you didn't understand something and you just want to. You didn't catch it, you didn't hear it, or you just kind of don't get the argument. Now, if you didn't hear something and it might be important, should you ask a question? Yeah, absolutely. But ideally, you're not in that position, right? Like your cross-ex goals, your goal as a debater should not be to get really good at asking questions when you're confused about what they said. It should be about improving your flow, getting a speech doc, hopefully, being familiar enough with the types of arguments that you just kind of know what's going on in the debate, and you can use the cross-ex for other more strategic things. But it's there. The next thing that you can use cross-ex for is I'm not I'm trying to decide if I want to get into a whole little side thing. I do want to get into a whole little side thing, because this is all in the video that we made, and that information is there. Let's get into this side thing. Okay. I'm just actually going to close this for a second. Okay. So one of the interesting things about parliamentary debate is that you don't really have a good way of disproving someone's evidence. It's a non-evidentiary format. People cite evidence, but you don't really show the evidence. You can't look at each other's evidence. So you can't really be like, here's all of the reasons why my opponent's arguments are bad, right? In public forum, you can do that, but the fact of the matter is that I think there's an overemphasis on that, because unless your opponent's really bad at writing cases, they probably found actual evidence that the arguments probably are true to some degree. The odds that a good team will have debate cards that you can just kind of like look at and tear apart really easily is really low. And you should be trying to get good enough to beat good teams, right? Your strategy should not be like planning on your opponent having a bad case. So the interesting thing about that is strategically, when you think of it from a parliamentary debate perspective, right, where you can't really attack the argument, all you can really do is use consensus, right? The judge must believe anything that both debaters agree on. And anything that the debaters disagree on, there's some ways that you can prefer one over the other, but usually it's like a wash, right? Like, how many debates have you seen where one side's like, increasing the minimum wage will increase unemployment, and the other side's like, well, this guy says it'll decrease unemployment, and then you're just like, well, I guess I'm going to try to make my decision based on something else. So really the strategy behind cross-examination is you are trying to generate consensus for the judge, right? You're trying to get your opponent to say something that you can then use later in the debate and say, look, they said this, we agree, so you have to believe it. And if that's true, here's why X, Y, and Z is also true. I kind of want to leave out a lot of the stuff that I talk about in the video. But let me just recap some of the basic stuff, and we can go more in depth into whatever is most interesting, whatever is most difficult. The most useful thing in debate, the most useful thing in cross-ex, the most important priority is making your opponent look bad, right? And that just comes back to the kind of like looking like you're supposed to win. The most useful cross-ex question is the one that is going to just make your opponent feel dumb. And I don't mean that in like a toxic bad way. And this isn't something to like brag about, because it was in a practice debate against a middle schooler and I was a grown adult. But I was doing a practice debate once. It was the law of the sea topic. And this kid I was debating against had an argument that said that joining the UN Law of the Sea Treaty would mean that a certain amount of money will be given to really small nations. And here's a separate card that says small nations are, that small nations are disproportionately likely to like fund terrorism. And it gives the example of a small country that like spends money like funding terror or like has terror attacks, or the money gets in the wrong hands, Afghanistan. So I had a cross-ex question. So what is something that you all might ask if someone's like, hey, UNCLOS gives money to small countries. That money in small countries disproportionately goes to like non-state actors that do terror attacks. What is something that you might ask that like might make that argument sound bad? Especially given that they use the example of Afghanistan. If you want to speak up, you can. I don't think you're going to speak over each other.
Mine wasn't really specific to UNCLOS, but I was just thinking those nations may be funding terrorism because they're economically impoverished, and by encouraging their economy, you're less likely to see terrorism.
That's a good point. here is something that I'm really going to emphasize a lot in this lecture, which is that almost every public forum debate round that I've watched, the cross-ex questions are not questions. They're like an argument, and then they'll be like, don't you agree? So how would you phrase that as a question is the thing. Now, you could try to say something like, well, why are these people funding terror attacks? But that doesn't really lead you to the point. So one of the really important things that you all should write down is that in cross-examination, you're not trying to get your argument out for two reasons. One, because your speech time is going to let you do that better. And two, you don't want to signal to your opponent what argument you're going to make and give them a chance to answer it right now, right? You want to put it on the flow, not give them a chance, and then create an opportunity for them to drop the whole argument. So while that's a good argument, a good response, I don't know that it's necessarily the best framing for the question. And Eric has the is right along the lines of what I went with. How would we phrase Eric's point into a question? That was, yes, Andy, that was exactly the question that I asked. I said, what body of water does Afghanistan border? And a lot of the public forum and other debate cross-ex videos that you watch will say not to ask open-ended questions. But I think if you know what you're doing and you know that the question is going to throw your opponent off and make them look bad, it will be really effective. And this was one where the kid just kind of like crumbled. And here's the thing, like the argument's not inherently untrue. UNCLOS does fund small countries. Small countries could be more likely to fund like bad non-state actors. They just happen to cite like the wrong example. And like if I was asked that question, I might have said like, okay, well, Afghanistan's an example of this part of the story, but if you want specifically an example of a like small country that funds non-state actors that would be affected by UNCLOS, look to Somalia. But that's not what happened here, right? That the person just kind of like panicked, fell apart, and then was like, the Indian Ocean? And I was like, no. And it just kind of like keeps snowballing and looking worse and worse. And like, you're going to win that debate. Like the debate's pretty much over at the point where in the cross-examination, one person just looks mortified. The other side looks like they're winning. It's an incredibly uphill battle for the team that kind of lost that cross-ex to bring it back. So that is the most useful thing you can do in cross-ex. That's one of the few ways that cross-ex can on its own lead to you winning a round. So always look for opportunities where instead of just pointing out like this argument's bad because Afghanistan doesn't border a sea, giving them a chance to come up, clarify, explain, put your opponent on the spot, ask them to answer a difficult question. Paul and I did a debate tournament in public forum on the Discord, and it was weird, and we went 3-3 and we lost a lot of rounds, and we didn't really know that much about public forum, but I think there's a lot of strength in asking people questions that they just don't have an answer prepared for and will make their argument sound worse. Like, for example, we ran into this argument. I don't remember who was making it, but it was like, if you can't distinguish space between things, then that means that there's no difference between like the af and the neg, and you need space. And so whatever, it was like a big, I don't remember if it was a K or what, but the point is that the question I remember asking is, what is space? And they were like, what do you mean? I was like, I don't know. You said space. What does that mean? And they're like, well, what do you mean? What does it mean? It's like, what? It's your, like you say, like your argument is based on the premise that space exists. Can you define that? And the harder a time they have explaining what space is, the less like well put together that position seems. Now, we might have lost that debate. I don't even remember. But the point is that there's a lot of questions that you can ask that are easy to ask, easy to think of, but might be hard to answer. And those questions will work even when you're not like, you don't have some sort of outcome in mind. If you don't have a question, it's always easy to think of some open-ended question that will seem scary to answer, but be really easy to think of. So another format of debate that we do in college is called IPDA, and it's just like a super basic, like if you've ever done SPAR debate, imagine like SPAR for grown-ups. And if the topic is on like presidents, right? Like the president should not have a term limit or something like that, right? One question that I would recommend a competitor ask during cross-ex is, who's your favorite president? Because you weren't prepared to answer that, and you kind of panic because you're like, I have to think of an answer, but I also have to like cross-reference that with all of my arguments because I don't know where they're going with this. I don't know if I'm about to contradict myself. And it just seems like an easy question to ask, but it feels like a hard question to answer. Those are often the most effective. And we can go into more specific examples if you guys want, or you can give me an example of an argument and what kind of questions I would ask. That's something that would be really great to do. The next best thing you can do with cross-examination is set up your arguments. And I don't mean make your arguments. I don't mean introduce your arguments. I mean establish premises, get your opponent to agree to something that they don't realize is going to be used in your argument, and then use that. I go into depth about this in the lecture video that we have. I can go a lot more specific if you all want. I'm happy to do that. That was kind of the point of me having a less rigid structure, because if you've seen that video, I don't want to be wasting your time. But if you haven't, I don't want you to be confused. But I do want to touch on another layer where I think public forum is specifically a challenge with cross-ex. Because every other format of debate that I'm aware of, the person asking, where's the lecture video? It is, I can put a link to it right now. Let me find that. Asking effective questions, I think. Proteus debate. Here we go. Here we go. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's pretty long, but everything is time stamped, and we can refer to specific parts of it. Let me just check something in this controlling time. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, and more people are here. Okay, the one thing that makes public forum different from every other format of debate when it comes to cross-examination is not even that you can ask questions at the same time, because you do that in public forum, or sorry, in parliamentary debate sometimes if you want. But really what sets it apart is the person asking the questions is not giving the next speech. So what happens in LD, right? Or let's say a partnered event, parliamentary debate. There's no rule about which, like if you just spoke, you have to answer the questions, but either member of the opposite team can ask the questions. So what you would want to do is, you know, the points you want to make, so you just ask them questions to set up for your speech. What's difficult in public forum is that you are setting up for your partner's speech. The only thing that you can really do based on like your own speech is like compare the arguments or ask for clarifications. But the most useful thing that you can do, other than making them look bad, right? But the most useful thing you can do on the flow is get them to commit to things, commit to an explanation, or agree to something that you know is going to be in your blocks or something like that, right? That requires you to have a really good understanding of the second speaker's arguments, which is difficult. Because I know that's, at least for like the average public forum debater, that's usually not the case. There seems to be a division of labor that goes on, and people are like, all right, I'll write the case, you write blocks. But what that does is that the cross-ex gets really difficult because you don't know what your partner is about to come up and say, so it's hard to set up for it. Additionally, it's difficult because you might have set something up or pointed out some sort of flaw, but if your partner doesn't notice it and follow up on it, then it's useless. So there's a little bit of failure to communication that makes public forum uniquely a cross-examination challenge, because the two speakers need to be really aware of what's happening in the cross-ex and what arguments are coming up to set up for. The only other thing that I say is like a really important reason to have cross-examination questions that I haven't mentioned so far, but is in the video, is controlling time. That's kind of like, it's more important than just getting clarification. But yeah, any time that you almost never benefit from answering questions if the question is good. You just maybe don't get hurt, but you almost never like, I'm so glad that person asked me this question. So the more time is spent focused on the question you're asking rather than whatever your opponent is asking next, the more strategically beneficial it is for you, because you just have cushioned time that you don't have to answer a question. So that's the only other aspect. I have some common questions that I want to get into next, some like bread and butter questions that I don't see a lot that I think are going to be really useful. So that might even answer the question from earlier about like question generation. But before I get into that, I want to see if there's anything that I can touch on that I haven't regarding what we just talked about, or re-explain, or elaborate more on. What can I elucidate? Okay, I'm going to move on, but again, feel free anytime you have a question, put it in the chat, or like speak or physically raise your hand or put on the little hand icon, whatever you want to do. Here are some bread and butter questions that I don't often hear asked, but maybe that's just my limited exposure to public forum. So paraphrasing is a really interesting thing, right? Because if you're not cutting the actual card, it's hard to say how accurately the card is paraphrased, and you can sometimes make it sound like a card says something that it doesn't. One common way that I see this in public forum is someone will read a card, they'll say Johnson in 16 says this, and then they'll say, which is why Smith in 20 says blank. But is that why Smith in 20 said that? Like I don't like, did Smith in 20 mention Johnson or even that same reasoning, or is that just like your way of transitioning? So like that's important, right? Because it's important to know what the warrant in the argument is. But anyway, that's one example of a way paraphrasing, even if you're not just like straight up lying about what the article said, can be misleading. One of the things that we ended up asking a lot when we were doing like the tournament in public forum was, where in your card does it mention blank? And this is a super common thing. So the topic that we were debating was UBI, and the negative was trying to say why, means tested welfare currently is good. And so a lot of the arguments that were coming from the negative were, here is this expert that says losing means tested welfare would be really bad and millions of people would die. The question we would ask is, does your card mention UBI? And if the answer to that is no, then it doesn't link into what we're talking about, because we're not talking about a scenario where means tested welfare disappears and is replaced with nothing. We're talking about a scenario where means tested welfare disappears and is replaced with UBI. And it's important to get clarification on, like, is your card talking about the actual resolution? And when I'm cutting cases, I always try to make sure that my evidence has some mention specifically of the topic, right? So right now the topic is what, like NSA? So I would want to know, like, where does this card mention the NSA? And that's if I've already looked at it and know that it doesn't. And if the answer to that is, well, it doesn't say the NSA, but my answer to that is going to be like, okay, it doesn't, and I just wanted to make sure it doesn't say NSA. That's fine. You can have a question. I don't really want to hear their explanation. And if they give their explanation, I'll say something like, okay, so that's just like analytics, right? That's not in the actual card. And that's really important to establish, right? That, like, a super common thing that I see in public forum is the cards will talk about general ideas that aren't specific enough to the topic. And just a simple question like, I couldn't see where this card mentions the NSA. Can you point it out to me? Will go really far, because it's setting up for the no link argument, but it also doesn't make them look great, because now they have to come up with some sort of off the cuff explanation for like how it relates. One of the things that I see in a lot of the videos for like what like bread and butter questions to ask is like basically repeat your whole argument or like paraphrase your argument and then ask like, why aren't you wrong? And I don't really agree with that. I think maybe, and this goes back to part of the disclaimer I gave, which is public forum isn't my background. In college debate, you have lay judges, but they're like speech coaches. They're not like a parent who has no idea what's going on. At worst, you have a judge that's been judging debate for years, but just doesn't really, know about theory or whatever. So maybe it's just super important to repeat certain concepts over and over again so that these people will understand it. I would try to make that clearer in the later speeches. So I don't think that there's a lot of utility in saying like, given that Johnson in 15 says that the NSA always commits crimes if they're able to, why should we believe your argument that they won't commit crimes? The reason why I don't think that is, again, when you're thinking about debate from a more technical standpoint, the easiest way to make your argument true is if your opponent has agreed to it with their own words, which they won't do if you ask them a question, right? No side's going to say like, oh, wait, you should vote against me. Or if they drop an argument. And so if your argument like is already on the flow and it's important, give your opponent an opportunity to drop the argument, right? And then just bring it back up when it's important, rather than be like, hey, I mentioned this one little thing that I'm telling you right now is super duper important. Can you make sure you get a chance to respond to it? Why, I would love to. So I don't necessarily recommend doing that. I think the problem with those questions is that like the question is, why are you right? And this is one thing most videos do talk about. You don't want to ask the question like, why are you right? Because they would have to be a very bad debater not to know, or at least very unfamiliar with their case not to know, which I guess happens a lot in public forum. People get arguments out of briefs or from a teammate and they don't really get the argument, but they're reading it, and just asking them to explain any of it will kind of make them look bad. But generally speaking, somebody who knows what they're doing, if you ask them like, can you tell me how this works? It'll just give them an opportunity to be really persuasive to the judge, cover anything that they didn't cover before, explain things more. So you don't really want to give them that opportunity on a platter. So I don't recommend asking questions like, given this thing, like, how does that work? Another thing that is really important in, I'm gonna give you another bread and butter question, but and then we'll kind of take another step back and talk about a big concept. So another kind of bread and butter question that I always ask if I am the affirmative is, like, why is this not better than doing nothing? So just to kind of like give some sort of perspective on that. In debate, there's an affirmative and a negative. And in public forum debate, the negative isn't supposed to run counter plans. It gets a little bit complicated because the topics aren't always, like, sometimes the point is the affirmative is always trying to change the status quo. And what that means is that every affirmative team should be trying to demonstrate that things are bad right now. And that's a really important strategy, and almost was what I gave my entire lecture based on. But if you can show that things are bad right now, that decreases the level of proof that we need in order to be willing to try to change it. Think of it this way, right? Maybe you are all in a room right now that has a window. Hopefully your room has a window. Think about, like, what would it take for me to convince you that it would be good for you to get a running start and jump out of that window? Now, a lot of people would say something along the lines of, well, you could give me $1 million. You could say you would give me $1 million, or you can try to assure me that the glass won't hurt, or all of that. All of those are framed in like future tense. They're all like results of what would happen if you tried running through the window, and me trying to say it would be good rather than you assuming that it would be bad. But that's not how most people actually make their decisions. Andy, in a direct message to me, has the right idea, right? So let me give you another example. The lottery. Regardless of whether people are already like well off financially or not, everyone would like to win $300 million in the Powerball, right? Even a billionaire wouldn't turn down $300 billion. So if everyone would like to win the lottery, you would expect that the people who can most afford lottery tickets would be buying the most lottery tickets, because it's the least trade-off, right? It's the best return for the lowest cost to you, because the cost of lottery tickets isn't going to make the difference between whether you eat or not. But every study shows that the people who play the lottery the most and gamble the most are by far disproportionately those of lower income. And the lower your income, the more likely you are to play the lottery. Why? If every dollar you have matters, why would you be more likely to spend that dollar on a scratcher rather than like trying to secure some food? And the real answer isn't like poor education or something like that. It's their status quo is really, really, really bad, and they are willing to take bigger and bigger risks to change it. Somebody who is fine financially isn't going to waste $10 on the lottery because it's probably not going to win. But somebody who's desperate for money is just more likely to be like, I'm going to take this long shot. So Andy's answer was, say that the house is on fire. Yeah. If you thought that doing nothing was worse than any possible outcome, then you're not really worried about what's going to happen with the glass or whether it's going to hurt or whatever, right? If I can convince you that the status quo is really bad, then you are likely to, in other words, vote affirmative. Similarly, if I convince you that the status quo is really good, you're going to not want to risk changing it, right? Say you are going to a tournament. You think of an argument. You think the argument's pretty good. And you go to the first round and you lose. And the judge is like, you know what was bad about your debate was that argument sucks, and that's why I voted against you. You go to the next round and you're like, well, maybe that was just bad luck. I don't think I said it right. You try it again, and your opponent laughs and is like, that is the worst argument I've ever heard. Judge, vote them down right now. And the judge is like, gladly. You keep going. Every single round you lose. And right before your final round, you're like, you know what? I think I thought of a better argument. Odds are you are going to try that new argument because the one that you've been running has not been working for you. But let's do it the other way around. Let's say you go to a tournament and you have this argument and you think it's good and you win the first round. The judge is like, that was a brilliant argument. You go to the next round and the judge is like, that is the best thing I've ever heard in my life. Next round, the team tried to answer it and they're like, we prepared for this. Here are our answers. Didn't work. It's just the greatest argument ever made. Then you're about to go into your final round, and right before your final round, you think, you know what? I think I thought of an even better argument. What are the chances that you would throw out the first argument and now try this new argument? For the vast majority of people, they would keep the argument that's been working. From a traditional risk assessment model, right? Like once you start driving, you're going to have car insurance. The way the people who determine your car insurance rates decide, those scenarios are identical because they look at the future. What is the projected, like, does this seem like it would have a better result? What percentage, how important is that difference, blah, blah, blah. And then they just go based on that. They don't look at, is the status quo good or is it bad? They just look at, is the projected outcome of this better than the projected outcome of that. But that's not the way human beings actually make their decisions. Human beings make decisions based on, are things good right now? Then don't change. Are things bad right now? We should change. And that's whether we're talking about like presidential elections or just personal financial decisions or whatever. So that becomes important in cross-examination because if you can get the other side to just agree that the status quo is good or that the status quo is bad, that is going to go a really long way for you in the debate. And your opponent probably isn't thinking that they're giving up all that much, right? Say you're the negative and you're saying like, oh, if we do this, some sort of terrible thing happens, right? Like let's say I was just talking to somebody on YouTube about like the Saudi Arabia topic with like weapon sales or whatever. And you want to say that if we stop sending weapons to Saudi Arabia, then they will be more aggressive or whatever, right? You have a disadvantage is what we would call it. And you just want to say it'll get even worse. So you don't think you're conceding all that much by agreeing to a question or just answering a question that would suggest, yeah, things are pretty bad right now. Like, yeah, it sucks that Saudi Arabia is attacking people in Yemen. But that can be used for a lot from the other side because now if it just makes it like more likely that the judge will think, look, I know things suck right now. It's not a guarantee it'll get worse. So let's just give it a shot. How could it be worse than what's happening right now? So that's another sort of bread and butter strategy is if you're the affirmative, ask questions that ask like, but with the UBI topic, right? The way we phrased that question was, okay, let's say someone is in poverty right now and they are not receiving welfare because they've timed out of it. Does UBI make their life worse? Like, how are they worse off than us doing nothing? And usually people would try to dodge the question. But the point being that you want to establish that like for a lot of people that you want to talk about, the status quo is already so bad, then we may as well just try something else. That strategy is called try or die. How would you get out of a question like that posed to you? Let's say you had this very scenario with Saudi Arabia posed with your side. Would you just say that it's the quo is better than your opponent's proposed world? How would I personally answer that? I guess that transitions us well into talking about like answering questions, right? So I will answer your question. It's a great question. Let me kind of get into kind of my like principles of answering questions. The first thing that you want to prioritize when you are answering questions is always answer using something that you have already said. So look to your case, see what you've already said that could answer the question, and always refer to that. Don't bring up new examples if you can help it. Don't bring up new analysis if you can help it. Always stick to what you've already said. Who can tell me why that's probably strategic?
You mean sticking to what you've already said in cross specifically, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
So a couple people have said, so that way you don't contradict yourself. That's definitely a major part of it. That's really good. But it goes beyond just that.
I would say maybe so that you don't like give your opponents room to respond to a newly burgeoning argument that you would make in your own speech.
That could definitely be part of it. Rohan says, emphasize your own case. The more they hear it, the more likely they're to believe it. All of these are like basic things that you hear a lot in public forum instruction, and they're all good and they're all true. I think there's a more important reason than all of these. And it goes back to emphasizing, why are we asking questions in the first place? The reason we are asking questions in the first place is to get your opponent to say something that you can use against them. And the safest way to answer questions because of that is use something you've already said, because the damage is already done. If they can generate a link, do you guys know what I mean by generating a link, right? So like when they say like their argument is related to what you said, right? If they can make an argument based on something that was in your case, then they're already able to do that. So if you answer using that same thing, they don't get access to new arguments. They don't gain anything from that. But if you bring up new stuff, you never know what that could have been used for. You never know if is this going to be used as a violation in a theory position? Is this going to be used in a critique? Is this going to be the setup for some completely different disadvantage, right? But while you also don't know whether the stuff you said in your case is going to be used that way, the damage is already done. You've already said all those things. There's no taking them back. So as much as possible, try to stick to what you've already said so that you don't create new opportunities for the opponents to get new things, right? That's what I was kind of talking about when I was talking about when you're asking questions, you're trying to get them to say things you can use against them. So generate something you can use for a theory position or something you can use to prove that blah, 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 right? Using the UBI topic, right? Like I might ask, so there's things that the other side might not be aware of, like welfare runs out. For whatever reason, a lot of people didn't know that about welfare when they were debating that topic. Like, yeah, you can't be on welfare forever, but UBI is forever. So I would ask questions that would kind of talk about like, try to get them to say that getting financial support for a long time is important. And they don't realize that that's going to hurt them, but because then I get to argue that we're winning on the long-term solvency, that makes it a reason to vote for me, because they agree the long-term financial whatever is important, and we win that we get better long-term finances. So because of stuff like that, you always have to be careful what new stuff you're giving your opponent, because if they're good at cross-examination, they're not just asking you a question for you to explain it to them. They're asking you a question because they're trying to get you to say something that hurts you. Because of that, there's also the second principle of answering questions, which is never back down from something you've already said, right? a lot of times people will get asked a question about something they said in their case, and immediately they'll start backtracking. So let's say, what's one of the arguments on the NSA topic that is common, or I can use as an example? Drone strikes. What's the drone strikes argument, if you don't mind, briefly? Okay. Okay, so the argument is that the NSA provides data for drone strikes, and that's bad, I'm guessing. So we should not allow the NSA to do surveillance so that they don't have this data for drone strikes, right? So let's say, oh, I see. Okay. So let's say we are saying, okay, information overload. So let them do surveillance so that they have less like clarity and ability to do drone strikes. Let's say that's the argument. A lot of times in the public forum rounds I've watched, someone will ask a question like, so are you saying that if we allow people to do surveillance, the NSA is going to be like so confused that they're not going to know like where to send the drone strikes? And the answer I always hear is, no, that's not what we're saying, but like it's going to still have some sort of effect. And what you just did is you mitigated your own impact. You had an impact. It was that they're not going to be able to do drone strikes effectively. You got asked if it's true. And because you kind of didn't want to seem, I don't know, I think it's a natural tendency people have. You just kind of back down because you didn't want to seem ridiculous or dumb, right? But your argument is that they are going to be able to, or are going to be overburdened. And the answer to that question is yes. So are you saying that like by doing surveillance, that they're going to be so overburdened with information that they're not going to be able to do drone strikes? Yes. Then maybe they get a follow-up. I think you should get to ask a question because you answered their question, but let's say they get the follow-up. Why? It's in this card. It says right here, here is the reason why that happens, right? So don't back down from your arguments just because you got asked about them, because again, the damage is done. You already made the argument. If they have a reason for why your argument is false, then they're going to read it regardless of how you answer the question, right? It's not like you can like back away and be like, oh, the impact's not that big. And then they'll be like, oh, I guess we'll just let you have that argument then, right? If they have a reason why you're wrong, they're going to read it. So if they ask you about it, don't like back down. Just try to maintain your impacts as much as possible. Don't give them anything. So one, when you're answering questions, always use stuff that you've already said. Two, if you're asked about something you've already said, like always stick by it, don't back down. And I think probably the third thing that's important to talk about when you're answering questions is that you want to keep your answers short and concise, because again, answering questions is almost never to your benefit unless they're asking a question like, can you explain this? Absolutely. I would love to take all this time and prep to reiterate to the judge everything that's good about my argument. But if they're asking you a question that like isn't that much of a gimme, then no, you definitely don't want to take a super long time answering, because in theory, you have your own stuff you're trying to accomplish in that cross-sex, stuff you're trying to get them to concede or agree to or establish or set up. So how would I answer the question like about the status quo in Saudi Arabia? Well, in theory, I would have a case, because I'm trying to write the negative, that already, oh, don't worry about it. This is a long thing and I just knew I would ramble for a long time. If you have to go at any point, that's fine. And again, the video will be online. So if I were answering that question, I would have already written a case that focused on something that's good about the status quo, because I know I'm the negative and I'm not changing the status quo. So I have to convince the judge that the status quo is good in some significant way. And if I'm asked, well, wouldn't you agree that people in Yemen getting attacked by Saudi Arabia is bad? I would probably say something like, not as bad as them all starving to death, if that's like my DA or something like that, right? I would just try to frame like what is currently good and what risks getting worse. So that's what I would do. What about when the opponent actually misinterprets your argument? When they're asking you a question or in the speech itself? So I'll answer it either way, right? If somebody's misinterpreting your argument when they're asking you a question, you would kind of want to say that, like, I want to answer your question, but I think you're misinterpreting. Like, I think the premise is misinterpreting what we're saying. If they are misinterpreting your argument in their speeches, cross-ex is still not a good time to do that, right? Because who you're speaking to, who you want to clarify it for, is the judge. Use your speech time to clarify things for the judge. Use your speech time to make the arguments. What cross-ex is for is getting your opponent to say things, to agree to things that will hurt them. And they're not going to agree that they misinterpreted your argument. Maybe this is an opportunity, like we said, the top priority is to just make them sound bad. If the way they misinterpreted your argument just doesn't make any sense, and you can kind of like point that out in a way that, what C is Afghanistan touching type situation, then yeah, you can do that. But you just always want to make sure that you're never asking the question like, here is my argument, don't you agree? I don't. Should be always the answer to that. And generally, I think whenever you hear people like saying that stuff in cross-ex, you should say, what is your question? Because that's, and one addendum that I want to add is that I think there's a really big focus on like politeness in public forum, which I think is important and good. In college, like, I don't know, people are less sensitive to stuff like that. So debaters can get a little bit more like, I don't know, snarky perhaps, or like aggressive. So I don't want to encourage you to be super aggressive if that just does not work in public forum. But I think you could, I don't think it's rude to say something like, I actually have a question if you don't have one. And it's important to, always have a question. So now let's kind of go back to the question that I got asked way earlier. And the person who asked it is now gone, but maybe they'll watch this, which is just, okay, I'm having trouble generating questions. What do I do? And the lame answer to that question is that you kind of just have to be better at debate in general. Being really good at cross-ex is kind of like being really good at writing a case, which is you can know what a cross-ex can do, but in order to know like which arguments are now good to go, or where is this flaw, what's going to make them look bad, you kind of just need a better round vision. What is round vision? Round vision is the ability to know what a judge is going to vote on or not vote on at the end of the debate while you're in the debate. And it's just about a familiarity with debate, and it's a little hard to develop. It comes over time. But one of the best ways you can develop your round vision is to put yourself in the shoes of the judge as often as possible. I think we all watch a lot of debate rounds. And when you're watching a debate round, you're either practicing flowing, or you're practicing okay, like how would I respond to this speech? Or you're kind of watching it and going like, oh, okay, can I use this thing? But very rarely do competitors watch around and think, if I had to vote for a winner at the end of this debate, who would I vote for and how would I explain that? Right? I have to write I have to write an RFD that says this team wins on this argument for this reason. And the more you practice that, the more you generate like a sense of this is what it's like for the judge. This is probably what this judge is thinking right now. Right now, there's 8 arguments bouncing around in the debate, and in the end, they are going to pick which one is the most important. How are they probably going to do that? How would I do that? The final focus, which Sean gave a lecture on, I haven't watched it yet, but if it's anything like the last speech in Parliamentary Debate, you should think of it as the debate is already over and you are just writing the ballot. So you are saying, hey, great debate, everybody. Good arguments on both sides. Here's why I think the affirmative team, or whatever, the second speaking team wins, because this argument was made, it was dropped. Here's how it's more important than these other things. Here's why it's true. It improves everything. And that's why I vote for this. And the only difference is you're just saying like, here's why you should vote for it. But your goal should be to write the judge's ballot. And the best way to do that is to just get good at writing ballots. And once you're good at writing ballots, then you kind of know better where to steer and which questions to pick in cross-examination, just like you know better what arguments to prepare in the first place. I think some things you can do to improve in cross-examination as you're waiting to improve generally is to follow certain principles, to know your partner's case, know your partner's blocks, know their arguments, know whatever. If you're the second speaker, know what extensions need to be made. If you know both sides, if you have your case prepared, you know all the arguments, it's going to be a lot easier to know what you're going to try to say later. And if you know what you're going to try to say later, you'll know how to ask questions that kind of set that up. If you ask a dumb question, how do you recover? I don't think there's really like a lot of dumb questions, right? Like, I think maybe you just completely misunderstood their argument, but I don't know. I think if you sound confident and you sound like you know what you're talking about, then the very worst case scenario, if you didn't understand their argument, you can play it off that their argument is confusing, especially if there's a lay judge, right? Like, odds are if you're confused about something, the judge is more confused about it. So with confidence, I don't think there's a lot of scenarios where you ask a dumb question, because the only way I can think of the question being dumb is if it's just completely wrong about what the argument is trying to say, and it's your opponent's job to explain that stuff to you. So that's kind of the way I would approach it, with kind of like a no dumb questions mentality. Yeah. I think now's a good time for, if any of you have like prepared questions from anything that we've talked about so far, to bring them up. I'm going to just quickly check if there are any important things that I wanted to mention. Oh, one other thing that I really quickly want to touch on is a lot of the videos I watched on how to be good at cross-ex talked about leading questions. Leading questions are a type of question that you're not allowed to ask in legal cross-examination, like in a court of law, but you're allowed to ask them in debate. And so a lot of those short videos will be like, ask leading questions. But every example I've seen them give was not a leading question. So I just want to, on the record, clarify what a leading question is. A leading question is a question where the question assumes something is correct, right? So what the examples they'll give is ask a leading question like, we're currently in a recession, correct? That's not a leading question. That's just asking if something is true. And they can say no. But a leading question is, no matter how they answer, if they say yes or if they say no, they're not refuting the premise. So if I said something like, does your mother know that you rob banks for a living? If you say yes, that means she does know that I rob banks. If you say no, that means she doesn't know that I rob banks. But neither yes nor no challenge the premise embedded in the question, which is why you can't legally do that, because you're getting people to implicitly agree they're bank robbers, right? So like a lawyer can't say like, did you go to the hideout after you robbed the bank? Because the person on stand can only give yes or no questions, and that's getting them to like, it's a cheating question. I don't necessarily recommend it because I feel like at best, I don't know, but it's there. I just wanted to clarify what a leading question is. It's not just saying like, don't you agree that the economy is bad right now? Because that's not that. Okay, what questions do you have about cross-examination or about debate in general? I'm happy to be here as long as anyone feels they still have a question about cross-examination or about anything else. So I have my evening free. Don't worry about me. But also, if you need to go at any point, don't worry about that either. How can I ask a question argumentatively without making it a refutation? I personally don't think that the argumentative model of question asking is effective. And I didn't do public forum debate, but so I don't want to completely just dismiss everybody who says that, but I don't see how it is effective. So by what I mean by the argumentative like question asking model, and you can tell me if this is representative of what you're asking, is something like, given that Johnson says that the NSA is spying on doctors and following them home and beating them up so that they can't cure COVID patients, how is it that your hospital's argument is going to work, right? That's an argumentative question because the premise is one of your arguments. I don't think that's necessarily good because I mean, it's good I get why people like it. They like it because it focuses debate around your evidence and it keeps the judge thinking about that and frames around whatever. But that question's only useful if you're not trying to accomplish anything with the question other than get the judge to think about your argument, which you can do more things with cross-ex that are more useful, right? If you're trying to get the other team to say something that is harmful to them, it probably hurts you to remind them your argument and think about how their answer and that argument could work together, right? Like your ideal response to a cross-ex answer. So if I ask you a question, right, and you answer it, my ideal outcome is at the end of that, I can say, perfect. That answers my question beautifully. Thank you. Because you just said something that is going to really hurt you and you don't know why. That's the ideal scenario, right? There's no scenario in which I ask an argumentative question and I get to, at the end of your answer, be like, and now I've proven the argument correct because I asked about it. Like, that just doesn't work that way. So also, quick side tip, you should answer when people answer your questions, you should seem happy about their answers, especially unless it's just a dodgy whatever, right? But it's really intimidating when you answer someone's question like, who's your favorite president? And someone's like, Garfield. And they're like, perfect. Thank you so much. And it's like, what did I just do wrong? And it, throws people off, puts them on tilt. What other questions can I answer? And if you want to type in your questions while I'm speaking about something else, I can just get around to it when I'm done answering that question. One thing, if you all have time, is I would really like to do a hands-on thing where either I read an argument or a quick speech and answer questions about it, or I'm given a speech and I'll ask questions about it, just to kind of demonstrate how this stuff works. More hands-on. I don't have a case like ready. I can find something, but if somebody has something they want to send me or they want to read and I'll ask questions, I think it's really helpful to see these things hands-on. But I also know that you have lives and places that you have to be, so that's cool too. Okay. Any questions, or is that something we're interested in doing, or do we want to call it? Okay, sounds fun. Sounds fun to me too. David, do you have okay, would you rather ask me questions or me ask you all questions? You can read a case. Okay, sure. Yeah, that sounds great, Joshua.
Okay. This is on this
real quick. So one of the other things that I'll say about CrossX is while I'm flowing, I will just write questions that I want to ask or somehow mark what I'm going to ask questions about. So that way I, know what I'm going up with. What was your question, Joshua?
I wasn't going to ask a question. I'm just going to say that this is an old case from this is February from UBA. It's a negative case. Okay, great. And I'm totally putting you on the spot here, so no expectations that it's going to be perfect. But yeah, if you have it and you don't mind, I'd really appreciate that. Okay. I'll read slow just so that you guys. I'm not going to time stuff. That's cool. Perfect. All right. Everybody ready?
Yeah, and I would recommend if you're following along to write questions you would ask, and then we can kind of compare what you thought of to what I thought of. Can you tell me what the topic is? It's the February topic, UBI versus perfect versus necessity welfare. Okay. Okay. Time starts now. We negate the resolution. Our sole contention is saving the environment. The affirmative world destroys our chances to save of environmental progress for two reasons. Point A is increased consumption. One of the primary goals of the UBI is to boost the economy, giving this money to everyone and not just those who need it most. Consumption in the U.S. will skyrocket to unsustainable and unnecessary levels. Massenil, 19, explains. Environmental impacts of nations consistently rise with per capita income. Income has also been found to be the main determinant of greenhouse gas emissions on individual and household levels. McNeil furthers, even if basic income were enacted via a direct redistribution of income, we would still expect negative environmental impact via increased consumption. In fact, consumption rising across all income levels is empirically proven to be true. McNeil finds that two studies of Alaska's basic income came to the same conclusion. Income from the APF increases individual consumption, irrespective of the income bracket to which the individual belongs. Goldsmith 12 explains why, writing that as the dividend became a regular and anticipated part of the income of Alaskans, recipients combine the dividend with their other sources and spend it in ways indistinguishable from their other income. He then empirically finds that most of the $24 billion has gone to consumption. Problematically, Goldsmith finds that this consumption caused an increase in the purchase of consumer durables, such as snow machines, boat motors, and related goods. The OECD explains consumer durable use contributes significantly to CO2 emissions. These are far from necessary purchases too. As USA Today reports last year that the average adult in the US spends roughly $18,000 a year on non-essential items. In sum, a 12
$100 UBI could see the average American increase their non-essential purchases by 66%, dramatically increasing our carbon footprint. But increased consumption is only half of the environmental problem. Subpoint B is oil reserves. A UBI carries an eye-popping price tag of roughly $3 trillion. Palmer Lowe in 2019 calculates a $12,000 cash transfer would end up increasing the budget deficit by about $1.5 trillion every year. By contrast, last year's federal deficit was roughly $1 trillion according to the balance. In order to offset what amounts to more than doubling the deficit, the U.S. will literally fuel the fire. CNBC explains in 2018 reports that CNBC in 2018 reports that in response to budget deficit concerns, the White House has proposed selling a significant portion of the strategic petroleum reserves to reduce the federal deficit. Now, this is not a new strategy either, as NBC notes that Trump is not breaking with presidential precedent. The strategic petroleum reserves was used during the Clinton and Obama administration to finance governmental budget needs. Worryingly, the administration has proposed selling as much as half of the reserves, or 317.5 million barrels of oil, according to the Department of Energy. Based on EPA calculations, selling half of our oil reserves will add over 136 million metric tons of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. To make matters worse, Foreign magazine in 2017 writes that selling our oil reserves will lower energy prices and ease fuel shortages. As a result, increased consumption and decreased oil prices are interlinked, both encouraging each other and fueling the demand of a newly used Americans, increasing emissions even further. Crucially, Lee 18 writes, reducing emissions from petroleum production is of particular importance as current transport fleets are almost entirely dependent on liquid petroleum products. Finally, the impact is global devastation. Reducing the United States' role in global emissions is vital. The New York Times finds last year that the United States makes up 14% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. This is in large part due to consumers, as Ivanova in 2016 finds that consumers are responsible for more than 60% of the globe's greenhouse gas emissions. Further, the United States is especially bad at consuming consciously. Scientific American reports that American consumers rank last in sustainable behavior. Despite these concerns, the world is not yet doomed. The Climate Action Tracker in December 2019 calculates a current pathway consistent with limiting warming to 2 Celsius with a 66% probability. An American UBI would thus destroy our currently strong chances at avoiding going over 2 degrees, as Claire 15 warns that 2 degrees Celsius is the maximum amount most scientists believe Earth can endure without experiencing irreversible climate shocks, including soaring temperatures and substantial rise in global sea levels, as Vox 19 quantifies the dangers, finding that we could potentially avoid $150 million excess premature deaths if we could hold warming at 2 degrees. For all these reasons, we urge a negative ballot.
Okay, thank you so much. I have some questions. It's going to obviously be a little bit different than a normal crossfire because you're not asking me questions.
Yeah, I do LD, so that doesn't matter.
Oh, perfect. Cool. I have some questions for you. How long's cross-X and LD? 3 minutes?
Yeah, you can go for as long as you want.
Okay, great. First off, just to establish some things, I can't see your case. Do you have a card that says on its own just the whole story that UBI causes like climate collapse?
No, but we have direct causation between UBI and consumption, and we have direct causation.
One card that says that. So why is it that like UBI and environmental experts like haven't made that?
Okay, so let me explain. UBI causes consumption. We have direct causation, and consumption causes climate change. No, I understand. I mean, I think that honestly, I think that it just hadn't crossed their minds. I don't know why it's crossed our mind rather than theirs. I don't think they've gotten to it.
Okay, they haven't
A
gotten.
lot of other things that they've talked about.
You read a New York Times article that said we need to reduce our emissions, but then you read another one that says things are good. So when is the New York Times article from?
Oh, no. Okay, I think you're misunderstanding. We're saying that we have a 66% chance of keeping everything at 2 degrees Celsius, but 2 degrees Celsius is the maximum we can go up to, right?
Sorry, so what does the New York Times say? Do they say we need to reduce things, or that things are fine the way they are?
Okay, let me just explain all this to you, just to simplify, because I know I can understand why you think that both cards contradict each other, but
it'd be even simpler if you just tell me what the New York Times says.
Fine, I'll the climate change, I'll tell you, the Climate Change Action Tracker in December 2019 calculates a current pathway consistent with limiting warming to 2 Celsius with a 66% probability. The New York Times writes last year that the United States makes up 14% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. That's what the New York Times doesn't say that we don't have a 66% chance. The New York Times just
that we need to reduce anything.
No, they just quantify that we how much we contribute.
Okay, that's fine. I have some other questions.
Go ahead.
You talked about selling oil reserves. Who would we sell our oil reserves to?
Literally, the majority of countries in this world don't have
oil
reserves. They don't have oil that they can mine themselves.
Specifically, that we would sell it to.
The European Union.
The European Union.
The European Union, Israel, China, India. Yes, any of these.
Sorry, I do have one more question. That's a fine answer. European Union, solid answer. Okay. So you talked about how increased income creates increased emissions. So does that mean that like the poor people who live in like abject poverty in Africa are like the worst polluters?
Excuse me?
So you said income means like relates to emissions. So are people in abject poverty the worst polluters?
No, we're saying that increased income increases emissions. So, okay. And also, I don't see how that question is very topical, given the fact that this is a United States topic. Okay,
thanks. Cool. So all of those, and also thank you. Actually, that was really good. You did a solid job. So the point of all of those questions was that I have some answer I want to give, and I'm just trying to get something that I can now come up and say, based on what happened in cross-X, you should give leeway to this answer. So I'm going to go in kind of flow order. I know that's kind of the reverse of how I went in the questions. And I will answer that last question. But first, let's talk about, do you have a card that says UBI and the environment? I think this really helps me with a lot of no-link stuff, right? Because now I have conceded that like, oh, these people just haven't thought of this. And I think it's going to be pretty, I'm going to have a lot of leeway to be like, I don't know, what's more likely, that the leading experts in the world haven't thought of this thing, or that you're making it up? After that is the last question, like, do the people who are in the most poverty create the most pollution? Now, what this card is trying to do, what the argument is trying to do, is to say that there's an inherent relationship between like income level and emission. And I'm just trying to disrupt that story to say, at least on some level, that there isn't a one-to-one relationship, right? The people in the most poverty aren't necessarily the biggest polluters. So I'm trying to disrupt that narrative of there is a direct correlation, and then I'll see what I can do with that in the next speech. But as long as I have some answer that says they're not always one-to-one correlated, that's going to give me some leeway. Did you have a question about that?
Just if I may, UBI is not widely considered as plausible.
Yeah,
UBI is not widely considered as something that people are going to do. So I don't think economists or environmental scholars are really thinking about its effect on the environment.
Maybe, right? And I'm not saying that your argument is wrong. I'm just trying to say how I would respond to it in a speech, right? That's the story I would want to tell. Even if there is a really good reason why people wouldn't have thought of this, the fact that you're saying people haven't thought of this, I want to make that seem bad. I want to make that seem like a reason to vote for me. Next, with the who would we sell it to argument, right? Like, I kind of put you on the spot. It was an open-ended question that you didn't have an immediate answer to. You gave me an answer, and I want to then hold you to that answer and try to like use that, right? Like, we ask who this is being sold to. They say the European Union. Hold them to that, because now we're spending our entire speech responding to this European Union analysis. And if they come up later and just give us a separate example, you should not like that. Here's why the European Union would not buy oil from the United States, because Russia is closer and is selling it cheaper. For example, right? Again, that doesn't make the argument untrue. It doesn't make the argument bad. It's a question of how strategically am I approaching cross-examination to try to use the questions I'm answering, the answers I'm getting, to help my responses. If I was just saying no one is going to buy this stuff, then that would be a lot worse. If now I have this specific European Union answer and I can show why specifically the European Union won't buy this. And lastly, with the New York Times stuff, I'd want to look at the card. But my understanding of the New York Times card was that, like, they're saying we need to reduce something. And the argument I would try to make, again, I don't know the card, I don't know how solid it is. The argument I would try to make is, your card says that this is non-unique because you're defending the status quo, assuming you're defending the status quo, not, counterplan or whatever. You're defending a status quo in which we are not reducing this stuff, which means all of your climate impacts are inevitable. So again, like, that's not necessarily yeah, I should stop. And I think we're basically I did want this in the example because I think it's going to be a good application of what I've talked about. But yeah, that's just a general idea of, like, I know those are the responses I want to make. I'm trying to ask questions that generate some sort of response that I can then point to, helping me make those answers. Any final questions or anything before we wrap up? Thanks again, Joshua. I don't know if you go by Josh or whatever, but
Either one's fine. Thank you.
okay, Josh, thanks so much. That was really cool of you. Yeah, any other? Yeah, no, it seems like we're all set. Well, hey, anyone watching this later, thanks again to the public forum Discord for having me. This was really cool. Thanks. I'll stop the recording. How do I do that? Stop the recording. All right.